Today I'm going to talk about Arthur Ashe, A Hard Road to Glory. His story is quite extraordinary. He did things that no one had ever done before, certainly in the world of tennis. As many of you know, tennis was among the whitest of sports, along with golf and hockey. Arthur was the first great black tennis player in the male draw, of course, in men's tennis. He had been preceded by Althea Gibson, the great women's champion, who grew up in Harlem and later was a protege of a man I'll talk about in a few minutes, Dr. Robert Johnson, who was also Arthur Ashe's mentor. So Althea had come first, but in many respects, Arthur Ashe is correctly, I think, labeled as the Jackie Robinson of men's tennis. But he was a Jackie Robinson with a difference. Jackie Robinson was accompanied pretty early on by a number of other great African-American ball players in the major leagues. But Arthur, throughout his 20-year career in serious competitive tennis, was alone. He was a Jackie Robinson without a Willie Mays, without a Hank Aaron. And I think that really bears upon the uniqueness of his story, dealing with his sole position in the sport and sort of navigating his way through his life. So let me start by talking about his early life. You really can't talk about Arthur Ashe too much without getting to his origins, his birth, and growing up in Richmond, Virginia. Richmond was a very special place within the kind of the larger context of Southern culture. It had been the capital of the Confederacy. Arthur was born on July 10th, 1943. Actually, the day that General Patton and Field Marshal Montgomery landed in Sicily. So it was kind of a very important day. But Richmond was a world apart from that. It had cradle-to-grave segregation. It had a sense of itself of being kind of the center of the Old South, moonlight and magnolias heritage. Living in Richmond, at least as a white person, was like living in a museum, really. They took Southern history and the Confederacy and all of that, the Civil War, very, very seriously. So Arthur had to deal with that. He was born, grew up in Jackson Ward, which was an almost all-black section of Northeast Richmond. Same neighborhood that the great dancer and entertainer Bill Bojangles Robinson grew up there. It wasn't a slum, as Arthur often pointed out. It was a working class black neighborhood. There was a Virginia Union College then, now university, which was just up the hill. And that gave the people in Arthur's neighborhood a kind of sense of maybe what to strive for, kind of a middle-class model. But most of them were not middle class at all. They had different levels of poverty, including Arthur's family. Both of his parents were descended from slaves in Virginia and North Carolina. He had a large extended family. He had one brother who was 5 years younger, Johnny. I'll talk about later. But many, many cousins and aunts and uncles, and a kind of nurturing family. I think he was very fortunate in that sense. But he lived in a pretty much all black world in his early years. And his father, when he was born, was a kind of handyman, jack of all trades, who made some of his money by acting as a chauffeur for some of the wealthier Jewish businessmen, store owners in Richmond. So Arthur had some contacts with whites through his father, but basically that was not a big part of his life. He went to all black schools, eventually went to Maggie Walker High School there in Jackson Ward. And a lot of his life, a lot of his story is impacted by the fact that his mother, Maddie, you can see on the screen, he was very close to her. His father, Arthur Ashe Sr., was kind of a severe man. They later had a good relationship, but in his early years, his father was a very strict disciplinarian. It had a particular impact on him, particularly after his mother died when Arthur was 6 from complications from a third pregnancy. It was a heart condition, and she died, and he was absolutely devastated. Family members told me that he didn't speak really more than a few words for months. He withdrew inside of himself. Was very different than the kind of lively young boy that he had been before his mother's death. And they at that point lived in Brookfield Park. That's the largest Black park in Richmond. It's not there anymore. It's now a post office that came through urban renewal. But in those days, it was quite an attraction for African Americans in Richmond. In contrast to Bird Park, which was the great white park, which had tennis courts and swimming pools and all kinds of facilities, but Blacks were not welcome there at all. And Arthur never played at Bird Park. In fact, many years later, after he became world famous and was identified with Richmond, Arthur was not the kind of person who held grudges or really ever raised his voice or ever seemed to be really outwardly, at least, upset about anything. But one thing that, as he said, stuck in his craw was when he'd be playing somewhere in Europe, for example, in Paris or in London. And someone from Richmond would come up to him and they'd say, "Arthur, we're so proud of you back in Richmond. I can remember when you were a boy and you played at Bird Park." And of course, he knew full well that Bird Park had not been desegregated in his years, and he never played there. And it was a real sore point for him that really bothered him, that they didn't remember the pain and the hurt and the isolation that he had gone through. He began playing tennis just after his mother's death in 1949, 1950. He would sit on the porch because his father was the manager of the park, kind of a security guard manager, and he actually built the house on Brookfield. They say they lived in kind of splendid isolation. They had a porch that was about 50 feet from 4 tennis courts, and the Virginia Union team would practice there, and people would give lessons. And there was a young man named Ron Charity who was 19 years old. He played for the Virginia Union team, and he would give lessons, and he saw this kind of forlorn little boy sitting on the porch day after day watching him, and he finally went over and tried to entice him onto the court, and it was very difficult. Arthur was incredibly shy at that point and very small. His arms and legs were like pipe stems. He was much smaller. He eventually grew to be 6'1", although he never went over 155 pounds. But in those days, he was just tiny. He looked 2 or 3 years younger than he actually was. But eventually, Ron Charity was able to entice him out on the court. I think Charity never thought in a million years that this little boy would become a serious tennis player, certainly not a world-class athlete. He was just trying to help him out. But it wasn't long before Arthur became the little boy who could play tennis. And he started playing seriously, at about 7 or 8 years old. And of course, he's all playing only against other African-American boys. But he started winning. Before long, he was beating all of the 8-year-olds and all the 9-year-olds and all the 10-year-olds. And he played. I actually started playing in a few little tournaments with the American Tennis Association, the ATA, which was an all-Black organization formed in 1917 as a kind of counterpoint to the United States Lawn Tennis Association, which was absolutely lily white, and maintained that mostly at private clubs. And the Blacks who formed the ATA were not welcome at those clubs, and so they sort of formed their own world, and that's where Arthur sort of learned how to play and how to sort of navigate his way through at least part of the tennis world. At 12, he won his first national championship with the ATA, and actually he went on to win one almost every year until he left for college in 1961. He also had a very fortunate development. Ron Charity knew a man named Robert Johnson. He was a doctor who lived in Lynchburg, Virginia. And he was a amateur tennis player himself. And he was the one person who felt that black players would never make it competitively. They would never be able to desegregate tennis. That the white boys and girls had such an advantage. Often they came from fairly privileged backgrounds and they played at private clubs, and African Americans didn't have that option. And so when they started to play, they might be 15 or 16 at best. And he wanted to start them much younger. In fact, he was the one who discovered Althea Gibson. That was his claim to fame in the early years. And he, of course, eventually became associated as Arthur Ashe's mentor as well. He would hold these summer camps at his house. He had 2 courts at the house in Lynchburg, and he would invite these young boys and girls and put them through a kind of tennis boot camp in the summer. He also, in 1949, he was traveling back to Lynchburg, and he went through Charlottesville, where the University of Virginia is. And for a number of years, the Interscholastic Championship had been held there, the National High School Championship, essentially. And so Dr. Johnson, known as Dr. J by Arthur, stopped, and he watched this tournament, and he talked to the director, Teddy Penzold, who was actually one of the few, I'd say, white liberals in Virginia at the time. He was the head of the Port Authority in Norfolk. And Dr. Johnson said, if I brought a couple of my campers over here, would you let them play in the tournament? And Teddy Penzold said, yes, I will. And so the next year, he brought two young black players. They hardly won a game, and they were kind of humiliated. But Dr. Johnson didn't give up. It took him many years for one of his players to actually win a match. So he realized how far they had to go. But that actually had a big impact on Arthur. He started going to Dr. Johnson's camp in 1954 and went every year until 1961. In fact, in 1961, just before he went off to college at UCLA, he actually won that tournament. And in a kind of bittersweet result, Virginia gave up the tournament just after Arthur won. They claimed it had nothing to do with race, but many observers doubted their sincerity in that claim. And it went to Williamstown, where Williams College is in Massachusetts. But Arthur fulfilled Dr. Johnson's great dream of winning that tournament.